When Sister Miriam first realized that doing the right thing could be interpreted as disobedience, it did not happen in a moment of defiance or confrontation. It happened quietly during prayer, when the words she had repeated for years suddenly felt hollow. Obedience, she had been taught, was the highest form of devotion. Yet that morning, kneeling in the dim chapel, she felt a dissonance she could no longer ignore. The rules she followed so faithfully no longer aligned with the compassion she believed her faith demanded. The convent where Miriam lived was known for its discipline. Order was praised, silence was enforced, and questions were discouraged under the language of humility. From the outside, it appeared serene, almost holy in its stillness. Inside, the rhythm of life was precise and unforgiving. Bells dictated movement. Authority flowed downward without interruption. Miriam had adapted to this structure easily in her early years. She believed certainty was a blessing and that surrendering one's will brought peace. But peace began to fracture when she was assigned to oversee the care of a young woman brought to the convent by her family. The woman was not ill in any medical sense. She was frightened, confused, and grieving. Her family believed her distress was spiritual weakness, something discipline and prayer could correct. Miriam saw something else entirely. She saw fear, isolation, and a desperate need for gentleness. When she suggested outside help, she was reminded that the convent knew best. Miriam followed the rules at first. She supervised prayers, enforced silence, and documented compliance. Yet each night, she noticed the young woman growing more withdrawn. Her hands shook during meals. She avoided eye contact. The signs were unmistakable. Miriam had seen them before, even if the convent refused to name them. Acting on instinct, she began sitting with her after hours, offering conversation when silence was prescribed. She listened without correcting, without instructing, without invoking doctrine. These small acts felt right. They also felt dangerous. When the abbess learned of Miriam's behavior, their response was calm but firm. Rules existed for a reason, she said. Exceptions created disorder. Disorder weakened faith. Miriam was advised to reflect on her role and to remember that obedience was not negotiable. The conversation ended politely, but the message was clear. Compassion without permission was a threat. Miriam tried to return to compliance. She followed the schedule precisely. She limited contact. She reminded herself that obedience protected everyone involved. Still, the unease persisted. Each time she looked at the young woman, she felt complicit in something harmful. The convent framed restraint as care, but Miriam could no longer accept that framing without question. The right thing, she realized, did not always align with what was required. Word spread quietly. Other sisters noticed Miriam's hesitation, her pauses before enforcing rules. Some avoided her. Others watched carefully, as if measuring the consequences of her choices. No one confronted her openly. Disapproval in the convent was subtle, communicated through distance and reassignment rather than accusation. Miriam understood the system well enough to recognize the warning signs. The town beyond the convent walls remained oblivious. Families continued to trust the institution completely. The church was the moral center, its authority unquestioned. Miriam understood that if she crossed a certain line, the narrative would turn against her quickly. She would not be seen as compassionate. She would be seen as unstable, disobedient, perhaps even dangerous. Despite this, she made a decision. One evening, when the young woman was clearly in distress, Miriam contacted a local councillor without approval. It was a small act, quiet and deliberate. She did not announce it. She did not seek validation. She simply acted. In that moment, she felt clarity rather than fear. The right thing was no longer abstract. It was necessary. The consequences came swiftly. Miriam was summoned the next day and informed that she had violated protocol. Her actions, though well-intentioned, undermined authority. She was relieved of her responsibilities and instructed to spend time in reflection. The language was careful, almost gentle. Discipline was framed as care, correction as concern. Alone in her cell that night, Miriam understood the weight of what had occurred. She had not raised her voice. She had not challenged doctrine publicly. She had simply chosen compassion over compliance. And that choice had been labeled disobedience. The realization was sobering. Doing the right thing had not freed her. It had isolated her. Yet beneath the fear, something else stirred. A sense of integrity she had never known before. She understood now that obedience, when divorced from conscience, became something else entirely. It became avoidance. It became protection of structure over people. That understanding could not be undone. Miriam did not know what would come next. She knew only that returning to unquestioned obedience was no longer possible. The rules had not changed. The system remained intact, but her relationship to it had shifted irrevocably. And in that quiet cell, stripped of certainty but anchored by clarity, she realized that the greatest act of faith she might ever commit would not be obedience at all, but the willingness to stand alone when conscience demanded it. After her removal from daily responsibilities, Miriam's days became strangely empty. The bells still rang, marking hours with the same precision as before, but she no longer moved with them in the same way. Where her time had once been filled with tasks, supervision, and quiet authority, there was now only waiting. Waiting was presented as mercy. Reflection, they called it. A chance to realign her spirit. Miriam understood it differently. Waiting was containment. She was instructed to remain mostly in her cell, leaving only for meals and communal prayer. No one spoke to her directly about what had happened beyond the formal explanation already given. There were no raised voices, no accusations. The convent did not need them. Silence carried its own weight. Each unanswered question, each averted gaze, reinforced the message that she had crossed an invisible line. During prayer, Miriam struggled to focus. The words felt familiar but distant, like echoes from a life she had lived before understanding their cost. Obedience, humility, submission. She had repeated them for years without resistance. Now they pressed against her chest, heavy and unresolved. She did not feel rebellious. She felt awake, and that awareness made the silence harder to bear. The young woman she had tried to help was no longer in the convent. Miriam learned this indirectly, through a passing comment overheard in the hallway, transferred back to her family. Someone said the matter was closed. No one asked whether she was safe. No one wondered aloud if the intervention had helped or harmed. The system preferred conclusions over questions. Miriam felt a sharp grief she had not anticipated. Acting had not protected the woman from removal. It had only ensured Miriam would be removed from influence. Other sisters reacted cautiously. A few offered quiet nods, fleeting moments of acknowledgement that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Most kept their distance. Miriam recognized fear in their restraint. Fear of association. Fear of becoming visible in the wrong way. The convent trained its members well. Survival depended on learning when not to be seen. The abbess summoned Miriam again several days later. The meeting was brief and controlled. Miriam was told that her actions, though motivated by concern, demonstrated a lack of trust in the institution. Trust, the abbess explained, was foundational. Without it, unity fractured. Miriam listened respectfully. She did not argue. She had learned that justification only strengthened the narrative that she was unstable. When asked whether she understood the gravity of her disobedience, she answered truthfully. She said she understood the consequences, but she did not regret the choice. That answer changed something in the room. The abbess's expression did not harden, but it closed. Miriam sensed the shift immediately. Regret would have signaled correction. Acceptance signaled permanence. The abbess informed her that further discernment would be required regarding her future role in the convent. For now, continued reflection was advised. The meeting ended without hostility, but with finality. Back in her cell, Miriam sat with the implications. She had not intended to challenge authority. She had not imagined herself as an example. Yet the system treated her as both. She realized then that the greatest threat she posed was not her action, but her refusal to frame it as error. Institutions could absorb mistakes. They struggled with conviction. As days passed, Miriam began to notice things she had once overlooked. How often rules were enforced selectively. How compassion was praised in theory but restricted in practice. How authority spoke in the language of care while protecting itself from scrutiny. These observations were not new, but they were newly unavoidable. Awareness reshaped everything it touched. She thought often about the meaning of disobedience. The word had always carried moral weight, associated with pride or rebellion. Yet her own experience did not match that image. She had not sought to defy. She had sought to respond. The disobedience, she realized, was not an act against faith. It was an act in defense of it. That distinction mattered, even if no one else recognized it. The town beyond the convent walls remained distant and unchanged. From her window, Miriam could see rooftops and narrow roads, the quiet rhythms of ordinary life. People went about their days unaware that anything had shifted within the convent. They trusted the structure completely. If they were told a sister was being disciplined for her own good, they would accept it without question. Miriam understood that appealing outward would only reinforce the institution's authority. The story would never be hers to tell. Isolation began to weigh on her in unexpected ways, not because she doubted herself, but because certainty had a cost. Standing alone required endurance that obedience never had. There were moments when returning to silence felt tempting, when regret seemed like relief, but each time she considered it, she remembered the young woman's shaking hands, the way fear had filled the space where care should have been. That memory anchored her. One evening, a sister slipped a folded note under Miriam's door. The message was brief, unsigned. "You did what many of us wanted to do," it read. "Be careful." Miriam held the paper for a long time. The words did not comfort her, but they confirmed something important. She was not alone in her awareness, even if she was alone in consequence. Miriam began to understand that doing the right thing did not dismantle systems. It exposed them. Exposure invited response, and response was rarely gentle. The institution did not need to be cruel to enforce compliance. It only needed to withdraw belonging. That withdrawal was enough. She no longer prayed for clarity. Clarity had arrived, uninvited and irreversible. She prayed instead for steadiness, for the ability to live with the cost of her choice without turning it into bitterness. She did not know whether she would be allowed to remain in the convent. She did not know whether leaving would feel like failure or freedom. She knew only that returning to unquestioned obedience would require abandoning something essential within herself. And that, she understood now, would be the greatest disobedience of all. Miriam's status within the convent shifted subtly after that note appeared beneath her door. No announcement was made. No rule was cited. Yet something in the air had changed. She was no longer simply a sister in reflection. She had become a reference point, a caution, a boundary others measured themselves against without ever naming it. Her isolation deepened, but it also sharpened her perception. With fewer tasks to occupy her mind, Miriam began to observe the convent as she never had before. The rituals continued with mechanical precision. Bells rang, prayers were recited, meals were served. On the surface, nothing was broken, and yet she saw clearly now how much effort went into maintaining that appearance. Harmony was not natural here. It was enforced. She noticed how sisters corrected themselves mid-sentence, glancing instinctively toward authority even when none was present. She noticed how compassion was allowed only when it did not disrupt order, how suffering was spiritualized when it could not be resolved. The system did not deny pain. It reframed it until it became acceptable, holy even. Days passed without direct instruction. This, Miriam realized, was intentional. Uncertainty kept her compliant without force. Not knowing what would happen next demanded energy. It prevented planning. It kept her inward cautious. The convent did not rush discipline. It let it ferment. During communal prayer, Miriam felt the tension most acutely. Standing among the others, she sensed their awareness of her presence. Some avoided her gaze. Others looked at her with something like admiration, quickly buried under fear. She understood them. She had once been them. Silence felt safer when consequences were abstract. The abbess summoned her again near the end of the week. This time, the tone was different, less corrective, more evaluative. Miriam was asked about her spiritual state, her doubts, her willingness to submit to further guidance. The questions were open-ended, but the expected answers were clear. Repentance, realignment, assurance that it would not happen again. Miriam spoke carefully. She said she was willing to learn, to reflect, to grow. She said she valued the community. All of this was true. Then she added something she had not planned to say. She said that obedience, for her, could no longer mean acting against conscience. The room went quiet. The abbess studied her for a long moment, then ended the meeting without comment. That silence was more decisive than any reprimand. By the next morning, Miriam was reassigned, not expelled, not punished openly. She was moved to work that required minimal interaction, minimal influence. The archive room, dusty shelves, old records, tasks that kept her occupied without placing her near anyone vulnerable. It was a demotion framed as necessity. Miriam accepted it without protest. She understood the language well enough now to translate it accurately. Working among the archives, she spent hours alone. The quiet was different there, less controlled, less performative. Surrounded by documents, she became aware of how much the convent relied on memory selectively preserved. Records of vows, transfers, appointments, few explanations, many omissions. The past was curated as carefully as the present. She found herself thinking about how easily stories disappeared, how lives were reduced to entries and then forgotten. Disobedience was not recorded as such. It was reframed, reassigned, removed. The system did not erase people violently. It edited them out. Miriam wondered how her own story would be written, if at all. A sister who struggled, a period of discernment, A quiet departure, perhaps. Nothing that would disturb the image of continuity. She felt an unexpected calm at the thought. Being misunderstood by the institution no longer felt like failure. It felt inevitable. Outside the convent, the town continued to trust. Miriam heard snippets of conversation when supplies were delivered or visitors arrived. Praise for the sisters' dedication. Gratitude for order and tradition. No one imagined what dissent looked like inside these walls. And why would they? The institution had perfected invisibility. One afternoon, as Miriam was shelving old files, another sister entered the archive unexpectedly. She hesitated, then closed the door behind her. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She said she was sorry. She said she admired Miriam's courage. She said she could never do what Miriam had done. Not now. Not here. Miriam did not try to persuade her otherwise. She simply listened. She understood that awareness came in waves, not commands. That survival meant different things to different people. When the sister left, Miriam felt a quiet resolve settle in her chest. Doing the right thing did not mean demanding others follow. It meant refusing to pretend harm was holiness. That night, alone again, Miriam reflected on how quickly the word disobedience had been applied to her actions. She had not broken a vow. She had not rejected faith. She had responded to suffering with care. And yet, that response had threatened something more important than rules. It had threatened the illusion that authority always knew best. She understood now why systems feared conscience. Conscience could not be regulated externally. It did not respond to hierarchy. It answered to something quieter and more demanding. Once activated, it did not return willingly to silence. Miriam no longer asked whether she would be forgiven. Forgiveness, she realized, was not what was being withheld. Belonging was. And belonging offered at the cost of integrity was no longer something she could accept. As she lay down that night, she felt the weight of what lay ahead. She would likely be asked to leave, or she would be allowed to stay in permanent diminishment. Either way, the path she had been on was closed. The certainty she once relied on was gone. In its place was something less comfortable, but more honest. She had learned that obedience could be virtuous only when it served life, not structure. That disobedience could be faithful when it refused harm. That doing the right thing did not guarantee protection, clarity, or reward. It guaranteed consequence. And Miriam understood now that the greatest disobedience was not breaking a rule, but refusing to let her conscience be managed. Whatever came next, she would carry that knowledge with her, even if it meant walking alone. The days in the archive blurred together, marked less by time than by repetition. Dust settled on Miriam's hands each morning. Paper whispered as she turned pages that no one had touched in years. The work was quiet, almost meditative, and that quiet gave her space to think in ways she never had before. She began to understand that isolation was not only punishment. It was also an experiment. The system wanted to see what solitude would do to her conviction. At first, she welcomed the silence. It allowed her to breathe without watching her words. But gradually, she felt the weight of being removed from relevance. Decisions were made elsewhere. Lives continued without her input. The convent functioned perfectly well in her absence. That realization cut deeper than reprimand ever could. It revealed how easily the institution could move on, how little it required any one person, no matter how sincere. Still, the archive offered its own education. Miriam noticed patterns in the records. Sisters transferred after conflicts, always for discernment. Assignments changed without explanation. Margins were filled with vague language that concealed more than it revealed. The words were careful, almost elegant. They protected the appearance of continuity while quietly correcting deviation. Miriam saw her future reflected there, already written in a tone she recognized. She began to understand that disobedience was rarely punished directly. It was managed administratively, reduced to paperwork, folded into procedure until it lost its sharpness. The system did not need to prove her wrong. It only needed to make her irrelevant. Occasionally, Miriam crossed paths with the other sisters in the corridors. The interactions were brief, polite, distant. A few offered smiles that carried unspoken meaning. Others passed her as if she were invisible. No one asked how she was. Concern might imply agreement. Agreement would be dangerous. Miriam did not resent them. Fear shaped behavior, here as reliably as faith once had. One afternoon, while cataloguing old correspondence, Miriam found a letter that had never been sent. It was written decades earlier by a sister whose name appeared only once in the records, followed by a transfer notice and then nothing. The letter spoke of unease, of witnessing harm, and being told to trust authority instead of perception. The handwriting was careful, restrained, almost apologetic. Miriam felt a chill as she read it. The language was different, but the struggle was the same. That discovery unsettled her more than any reprimand. It meant her experience was not unique. Others had stood where she stood, felt what she felt, and disappeared quietly. The system did not fear individual acts of conscience. It relied on their isolation. Separation prevented accumulation. History repeated itself because it was never allowed to connect. Miriam returned the letter to its place, her hands steady but her thoughts racing. She realized then that her greatest mistake, in the eyes of the institution, was not contacting a counselor. It was acting as if her conscience mattered more than procedure. That assumption disrupted the hierarchy far more than any rule-breaking could. Later that evening, she was called to the abbess's office once more. This time, the conversation was brief and unmistakably final. Miriam was told that extended discernment outside the convent would be in her best interest. The phrasing was gentle. The meaning was not. She was being asked to leave, temporarily in theory, indefinitely in practice. Miriam listened without protest. She had imagined this moment many times. She had feared it. Now that it had arrived, she felt an unexpected stillness. Leaving would cost her identity, her community, the structure that had defined her adult life. Staying would cost her conscience. The choice had already been made, even if the words were only now catching up. That night, Miriam packed slowly. Her belongings were few. The habit folded neatly on the bed felt heavier than it should have. It carried years of devotion, certainty, and surrender. She touched the fabric gently, not with bitterness, but with gratitude for what it had once meant. Then she folded it away. As dawn approached, Miriam stood at the window of her cell and looked out at the town beyond the convent walls. Lights flickered on in homes. Ordinary life began its quiet movement. No one knew what was ending here. No one needed to. The institution would continue. The town would remain confident in its moral center. Her departure would not disturb the surface. Miriam understood now that doing the right thing had not changed the system. It had changed her. It had stripped away illusion and replaced it with responsibility. Responsibility did not promise safety. It promised alignment. That would have to be enough. When she stepped beyond the convent gates, there was no ceremony, no farewell, just the sound of gravel beneath her shoes and the morning air against her face. She did not know where she was going yet. She only knew where she could not stay. She had learned that obedience demanded silence, and silence demanded forgetting. She had chosen neither, and as she walked away, carrying uncertainty instead of permission, Miriam understood that the greatest act of faith she would ever make was not obedience to authority, but loyalty to conscience, even when it cost her everything she had once called home. Miriam did not look back as she walked down the narrow road leading away from the convent, not because she was afraid of what she might feel, but because she understood that looking back would invite comparison. Comparison with a life that no longer existed, with certainty that had already dissolved. The past did not need her attention anymore. It had given her what it could. The town woke around her slowly. A delivery truck passed without slowing. A woman swept her porch. Someone opened a shop door and adjusted a sign. Ordinary life continued with practiced indifference. Miriam realized then how complete the separation truly was. Her departure was not a rupture. It was an absence. The system had not expelled her dramatically. It had simply released her into invisibility. She carried little. A bag of clothes, a few books, papers she had been allowed to keep. Nothing that could anchor her to what she had been. As she walked, the weight she felt was not physical. It was the sudden responsibility of self-direction. For years, decisions had been made for her. Even dissent had occurred within defined boundaries. Now there were no bells, no schedules, no permissions to seek or defy. Freedom arrived without instruction. The first days were disorienting. Miriam stayed in a small room above a closed parish office, a temporary arrangement made without warmth or hostility. She was grateful for the shelter and unsettled by the quiet. Without structure imposed from outside, time stretched unevenly. Mornings came without summons. Evenings arrived without ritual. She had to decide how to inhabit them. She noticed how deeply obedience had shaped her body. She woke early out of habit. She hesitated before speaking, even when no one was present. She felt an impulse to justify herself, to explain her choices to imagined authorities. These reflexes surprised her. Leaving the convent had not erased its imprint. The discipline lingered, internalized and persistent. Miriam spent long hours walking. The town anonymous now. Without the habit, she moved differently through space. People passed her without recognition. Some smiled politely, others ignored her. The invisibility felt strange but relieving. No one expected anything of her. No one projected holiness or suspicion. She was simply another woman moving through the day. At night, doubt crept in quietly. Not about her decision, but about her future. She had no clear path, no vocation to step into. The language she once used to define herself no longer applied. She wondered whether she had traded one form of constraint for another, less visible but equally demanding. Uncertainty pressed hard in the absence of structure. Still, there were moments of unexpected clarity. Simple choices carried weight. What to read, where to walk, when to rest. These decisions, once trivial or forbidden, now belonged to her. Each choice felt like an assertion of presence. Small, uncelebrated, but real. Miriam began volunteering at a local shelter. After noticing a sign posted near the market, she did not announce her background. She did not seek authority. She served meals, cleaned tables, listened when people spoke. The work was ordinary and grounding. No one asked her to justify compassion. No rule framed care as threat. For the first time in a long while, her actions did not require permission. She noticed something else, too. Her instinct to differ softened slowly. When she saw harm, she spoke. When she sensed need, she responded. There were consequences sometimes. Discomfort, disagreement. But they were proportionate, human, not structural, not designed to erase her. Occasionally, she thought of the young woman she had tried to help. She wondered where she was now, whether anyone had listened to her fear. That unanswered question remained a quiet ache. Miriam understood that doing the right thing did not guarantee outcomes. It guaranteed alignment. That distinction mattered now more than ever. Letters arrived from the convent eventually. Polite, formal, non-committal. They spoke of prayer, of ongoing discernment, of future possibilities left deliberately vague. Miriam read them carefully, then set them aside. The language offered comfort without accountability. She no longer mistook one for the other. As weeks passed, Miriam felt something unfamiliar growing beneath the uncertainty. Not confidence, exactly, but trust. Trust in her ability to navigate without certainty. Trust that conscience could guide action, even without institutional endorsement. Trust that faith, stripped of obedience, did not disappear. It changed shape. She realized then that disobedience had never been the act of contacting a counselor. It had been the refusal to surrender her moral perception. Everything else had followed from that refusal. The system could not tolerate it, because systems relied on managed perception, on obedience that did not ask where it led. Miriam's life would not be simpler from here. She knew that. She had lost protection, identity, belonging, but she had gained something more difficult to take away. She had learned how to listen to herself without asking permission. And in that listening, she found a quiet conviction settling in her bones. Doing the right thing had cost her everything she once depended on. But it had given her something the convent never could, the freedom to remain whole. Miriam began to understand that wholeness was not a feeling, it was a practice. In the weeks that followed, life did not resolve into clarity or purpose the way stories often promised. There was no sudden calling, no reassuring sign that she had chosen correctly. Instead, there was repetition, days that resembled one another, mornings that asked to be entered without certainty, evenings that arrived with fatigue and unanswered questions. Freedom, she learned, was not lightness. It was responsibility without scaffolding. At the shelter, people did not ask who she had been. They cared only about who she was in the moment, whether she listened, whether she showed up when she said she would, whether her attention was real. That simplicity unsettled her at first. She had been trained to believe meaning came from structure and recognition. Here, meaning emerged quietly, through consistency. She noticed how often she still measured herself against an internal authority. A voice that asked whether she was doing enough, whether she was wasting her life, whether leaving had been selfish. Miriam learned to sit with that voice without obeying it. She recognized it now as residue, not truth. It softened gradually, losing urgency as her days filled with lived experience rather than imagined judgment. Faith returned to her slowly, without language. She did not attend services regularly. She did not recite prayers as she once had. Instead, faith appeared in attention, in restraint, in the way she resisted turning suffering into explanation. She no longer needed belief to justify harm. She allowed mystery to remain unresolved. That, too, felt like faith. There were moments when loneliness pressed hard, evenings when she missed the familiarity of communal life, the shared rhythm of prayer, the comfort of knowing where she belonged. She did not deny that loss. Leaving had taken something from her that could not be replaced exactly. But she also recognized that belonging purchased at the cost of conscience had never been sustainable. What she missed was not the structure itself, but the hope she once placed in it. Occasionally, she encountered sisters from other communities while volunteering or attending meetings. The conversations were careful, coded, a shared glance, a question asked indirectly. Miriam understood the caution. She offered neither warning nor encouragement. She offered presence. Each woman would have to decide for herself what she could bear and when. Conscience could not be outsourced. One afternoon, Miriam received a message from a number she did not recognize. It was brief. The young woman she had once tried to help was safe. Someone had finally listened. No details, no explanation, just that. Miriam sat quietly for a long time after reading it. Relief came, but it was gentle, not triumphant. Doing the right thing had not saved her in the way stories promised, but it had mattered. Sometimes that was the only certainty available. As months passed, Miriam stopped introducing herself through what she had lost. She was no longer a former sister in her own mind. She was simply Miriam, a woman who had learned something costly and refused to unlearn it for comfort. Her past did not disappear. It informed her without defining her. The town remained indifferent. The convent remained intact. The system that had turned away from her continued without interruption. Miriam no longer measured success by whether anything there had changed. Change was not always visible. Sometimes it occurred internally, quietly, in ways no institution could track. She understood now that obedience had once offered her safety by relieving her of choice. Disobedience had demanded she choose continuously, without guarantee. That demand was exhausting. It was also honest. She would not trade it back. There was no moment when she declared herself healed. Healing, she realized, was not a destination. It was the ability to live without betraying oneself, even when life remained uncertain. Some days she managed it well. Other days she faltered. Both belonged to the truth. Miriam did not know what her life would look like in 5 years. She did not need to. The question that once ruled her, whether she was allowed to do the right thing, no longer held power. She had answered it already, not with words, but with action. Doing the right thing had become the greatest disobedience, not because it rejected faith, but because it refused to let faith be used as a substitute for conscience. And in a world that depended on quiet compliance to function, that refusal was not small. It was enough to build a life on. Miriam's life settled into something that looked ordinary from the outside. That ordinariness carried a strange relief. No one watched her for signs of alignment or deviation. No one evaluated her silence or her speech for loyalty. The absence of scrutiny created space she was still learning how to inhabit. Freedom, she realized, was not only about choice. It was about being unseen in ways that did not erase you. She began to notice how deeply the language of obedience had once organized her thinking. Even now, when faced with simple decisions, she felt the old impulse to ask what was expected rather than what was needed. The reflex surprised her. It reminded her that systems did not end at their gates. They followed you, internalized, persuasive, patient, and doing them required attention, not defiance. At the shelter, a woman once asked her why she listened so carefully. The question was not curious, just observational. Miriam paused before answering. She said she had learned what happened when people were told not to trust their own perception. The woman nodded, as if that explained everything. No further justification was required. Miriam felt a quiet affirmation settle in her chest. She stopped trying to explain her past to herself. The story no longer needed revision or defense. It was what it was. What mattered was how she lived now, how she responded when fear surfaced, how she acted when compassion required inconvenience. These moments arrived without announcement. They tested her more honestly than rules ever had. There were still days when uncertainty pressed hard, when she missed the clarity that came from structure, even when that structure had harmed her. Certainty, she understood now, was seductive. It promised relief from responsibility, but it also demanded submission. Miriam had learned the cost of that bargain too well to repeat it. She found herself speaking more, often gently but clearly, when she noticed harm in everyday settings. At the shelter, in meetings, in conversations that drifted toward dismissal or judgment. She did not raise her voice. She did not seek authority. She named what she saw. Sometimes it changed nothing. Sometimes it shifted everything. The outcome was never guaranteed. The practice remained. Faith continued to exist without declaration. Miriam no longer felt compelled to define it. It appeared in how she refused to simplify suffering, in how she resisted the urge to explain pain away. in how she allowed herself to be present without answers. That presence felt truer than any vow she had once taken. She understood now that the greatest disobedience was not a single act, but a posture, a refusal to surrender conscience for belonging, a willingness to remain awake when sleep was easier. This posture did not make life simpler. It made it real. Miriam did not imagine herself as courageous. Courage implied fearlessness. What she felt was resolve, imperfect and ongoing. Resolve to remain honest, to choose care even when it cost her comfort, to live without outsourcing moral responsibility to institutions that preferred silence. The convent still stood on its hill. The town still trusted it. Nothing outward had changed, and yet something irreversible had occurred. Miriam no longer needed permission to do the right thing. She no longer confused obedience with faith. That clarity could not be taken from her. Her life would continue to unfold without guarantees. There would be losses she could not foresee and joys she could not plan. But beneath all of it ran a steady knowledge she carried with her now, unshakable. Doing the right thing had once been framed as disobedience. Now it was simply how she lived. And that, she understood, was enough. Miriam rarely thought now about whether her life looked meaningful from the outside. That question had lost its grip on her. Meaning, she had learned, was not something granted by visibility or approval. It was something felt internally when action and conscience aligned, even imperfectly, especially imperfectly. She began to notice how often people around her hesitated before doing what they already knew was right. Not because they were cruel or indifferent, but because they were afraid of consequence, afraid of being misunderstood, afraid of losing belonging. Miriam recognized that fear intimately. She did not judge it. Fear was rational in systems that punished integrity quietly. When she sensed that hesitation in others, she did not urge them forward. She did not offer slogans or certainty. She shared her presence instead. She listened. Sometimes she named what she saw. Sometimes she remained silent. She had learned that pressure, even toward good ends, could reproduce the same harm she had escaped. Conscience needed room, not commands. There were moments when someone would ask her directly if she regretted leaving. The question was never hostile. It carried genuine curiosity, sometimes concern. Miriam answered honestly. She said she grieved what she had lost. She missed the rhythm, the shared language, the sense of being held by something larger than herself. But she did not regret refusing to betray her own perception of harm. Grief and clarity could coexist. One did not cancel the other. She realized then that many people assumed regret was the natural consequence of disobedience. That suffering proved error. Miriam understood how deeply that belief ran. Systems relied on it. If pain meant you were wrong, then endurance of harm could be reframed as virtue. She no longer accepted that equation. Pain proved cost, not mistake. Her days remained simple. She volunteered. She read. She rested. She learned to rest without apologizing for it. That, too, felt like a small rebellion. Productivity had once been equated with worth. Now she allowed herself to exist without constant justification. This was not laziness. It was repair. Occasionally, she caught herself imagining what she might say if she were invited back to speak, to explain, to clarify. She noticed the impulse without indulging it. Explanation was not owed. Understanding could not be forced. The desire to be understood was human, but it no longer guided her choices. She conserved her energy for what could actually be touched. Faith continued to surprise her. It appeared in unexpected places, in shared laughter, in restraint when anger would have been easier, in the decision to remain open rather than armored. She no longer feared losing faith. She feared losing attentiveness. That fear kept her grounded. Miriam understood now that obedience had once promised her innocence. If she followed rules, responsibility would belong to someone else. Disobedience had returned responsibility to her fully. That return was heavy. It required discernment without guarantee, but it also honored her as a moral agent, not a vessel. She no longer framed her story as loss or victory. It was neither. It was a transition from certainty to integrity, from safety to honesty, from belonging managed by others to belonging shaped internally. The cost had been real. The gain was quieter, but enduring. The world around her remained largely unchanged. Institutions still functioned. Authority still spoke confidently. Silence still protected power in many places. Miriam did not mistake her individual life for a solution to systemic harm. She was clear-eyed about scale. And yet, she also knew that systems depended on individuals continuing to comply without question. Every refusal mattered, even when it was small and unseen. She had learned that doing the right thing did not always feel noble. Often it felt lonely, inconvenient, unspectacular. It did not come with clarity or relief. It came with consequence. But it also came with a kind of peace that did not require denial. Miriam did not wait anymore for permission to live this way. She did not wait for reconciliation, acknowledgement, or resolution. Those things might never arrive. Her life did not need to be paused until they did. Doing the right thing had once been the greatest disobedience. Now it was simply her posture toward the world. And in choosing that posture again and again, without applause or certainty, Miriam had found something steadier than obedience and stronger than fear. She had found herself. Miriam sometimes wondered how many lives unfolded quietly, alongside hers, shaped by similar choices, never intersecting, never named. The thought did not make her feel small. It made her feel connected. Resistance, she understood now, was rarely coordinated. It was distributed. It lived in individual decisions made without witnesses, in moments where someone chose integrity over ease and then continued living. She had stopped expecting her life to feel resolved. Resolution implied closure, and closure was a luxury stories often promised but reality rarely delivered. What she had instead was orientation. She knew what she would not do. She knew what she could no longer unsee. That knowledge acted like a compass, imperfect but reliable. At the shelter, she was eventually asked to help coordinate volunteers. The role came without ceremony. No title, no authority bestowed from above. It emerged naturally because people trusted her presence. Miriam accepted carefully. She remained alert to the ways power could creep in unnoticed, even in good spaces. She invited feedback. She shared decisions. She resisted becoming central. Leadership, she had learned, was not about position. It was about responsibility without domination. There were moments when old fears resurfaced, when disagreement felt like threat, when criticism triggered the instinct to withdraw or submit. Miriam noticed these reactions with curiosity rather than shame. Healing, she understood, did not erase conditioning. It loosened its grip. Each time she responded differently, the pattern weakened. She thought less frequently now about the convent itself and more about what it represented. A place where moral certainty was centralized, where conscience was managed rather than trusted, where obedience was safer than discernment. These structures existed far beyond religious walls. Miriam saw them in workplaces, families, communities. Recognizing the pattern helped her avoid recreating it, even unintentionally. People sometimes assumed that leaving had made her angry. She understood why. Anger was a familiar narrative, easier to digest than clarity. Miriam did feel anger at times, sharp and justified, but it was not her foundation. Anger flared and passed. What remained was attentiveness. That attentiveness guided her more consistently than outrage ever could. She learned to forgive herself for the years she had not questioned, for the harm she might have overlooked while trying to be faithful. Forgiveness did not erase responsibility. It allowed movement. She could not change the past, but she could refuse to repeat it. That refusal was an act of care, not condemnation. As time went on, Miriam noticed that people trusted her with things they had never spoken aloud. Doubts, fears, moments of moral confusion they felt ashamed to admit. She held these confidences carefully. She did not rush to resolve them. She understood now that being heard without correction could be transformative. Silence, when chosen to protect rather than erase, had power too. Her life did not become easier in any dramatic way. Financial uncertainty lingered. Relationships required effort. The world remained unstable and often unjust, but she no longer felt divided within herself. That internal coherence made difficulty bearable. She was not constantly negotiating between who she was and who she was expected to be. Miriam understood now that obedience had once given her identity without asking for discernment. Disobedience had taken identity away and forced her to rebuild it consciously. That rebuilding was slow. It required patience she had never practiced before, but it was real. She no longer measured her life against ideals of sacrifice or virtue. Those ideals had too often been used to justify harm. She measured it instead against honesty. Was she telling the truth to herself and others? Was she acting in ways that reduce harm rather than explaining it away? These questions were not simple. They were sufficient. Occasionally, she imagined someone from the convent watching her now, trying to decide whether she had failed or been corrupted by the world. The thought no longer unsettled her. The framework itself had lost authority. She did not need to be pure. She needed to be present. Miriam knew that there would always be people who believed obedience was safer than conscience, and they were not entirely wrong. Obedience did offer protection, It offered belonging. It offered relief from responsibility. What it could not offer was integrity when harm became visible. She had chosen the harder path, not because it was noble, but because it was unavoidable once she saw clearly. That clarity had not made her exceptional. It had made her accountable. Doing the right thing had once cost her everything she knew. Now it asked for something quieter every day. Attention, honesty, the courage to continue without certainty. And Miriam, having learned what obedience demanded and what disobedience revealed, chose that courage again. Not once, but daily. Miriam no longer counted the days since she had left. Time had stopped organizing itself around rupture. The convent was no longer a dividing line in her life, but a chapter that informed how she moved forward. Memory softened its edges. What remained was instruction, not injury. She noticed how often people around her spoke about doing the right thing as if it were obvious, as if morality announced itself clearly and consequences followed logically. Miriam knew better now. Doing the right thing was often quiet, ambiguous, and isolating. It rarely came with affirmation. More often, it came with loss that could not be explained cleanly to others. That did not make it less necessary. It made it more costly. At the shelter, a disagreement surfaced one afternoon about how to respond to a difficult situation. Voices stayed calm, but tension lingered. People looked to Miriam instinctively. She felt the old reflex stir, the pull toward authority. She paused deliberately. Then she asked questions instead of giving direction. What did they see? What did they fear? What harm were they trying to avoid? The room shifted. Responsibility redistributed itself. Miriam felt something loosen inside her. This was leadership without obedience, influence without erasure. Later that night, she reflected on how easily she could have stepped into control, how familiar that position once felt. She understood now that power often arrived disguised as helpfulness. The temptation was not cruelty, it was certainty. Certainty relieved others of burden. It also silenced them. Miriam chose discomfort instead. Her relationship with faith continued without labels. She no longer felt compelled to claim or reject it publicly. Faith existed in her attention to consequence, in her refusal to look away when something felt wrong. She prayed sometimes, but the prayers were simple. Not for protection, not for answers, for steadiness, for the ability to remain awake without becoming hardened. She learned to recognize when fatigue threatened to turn discernment into withdrawal. Rest became part of her ethics. Exhaustion made obedience tempting again. When she rested, she thought more clearly. She protected that clarity carefully, understanding how easily systems exploited depletion. People sometimes asked her why she still cared, why she did not simply move on and forget. Miriam answered honestly. Forgetting was a luxury she did not have. What she had seen had reshaped her. Understanding of responsibility. Caring was not a burden she carried reluctantly. It was a consequence of attention. Once you saw harm clearly, indifference required effort. She did not romanticize her path. There were days she wished she could trade integrity for ease, even temporarily. Those days passed. She did not judge them. Wanting relief did not mean wanting erasure. She allowed herself to want comfort without letting that desire decide her actions. Miriam understood now that obedience had once offered her a map. It told her where to stand, when to move, how to think. Disobedience had taken the map away and given her a compass instead. The compass did not provide certainty. It required orientation. It demanded presence. It could not be followed mechanically. That demand was exhausting. It was also alive. She no longer imagined her story as an exception. It was one among many, shaped by the same structures that rewarded silence and punished attention. What made the difference was not bravery, but refusal. Refusal to explain harm away. Refusal to surrender conscience for belonging. Refusal to disappear quietly. The convent remained where it had always been. The town remained unchanged. Systems endured. Miriam did not measure her life against their permanence. Permanence was not the same as truth. She had learned that systems could last a very long time while remaining profoundly wrong. What mattered was how she lived now. Whether her presence reduced harm or reinforced it. Whether her choices aligned with what she knew. These questions guided her more reliably than any rulebook ever had. Doing the right thing had once been framed as disobedience. Now it was simply the condition of her life. And Miriam, having learned the cost of obedience without conscience, chose to live with her eyes open, even when it was easier not to, even when no one was watching. That, she understood, was the quiet work that never ended. Miriam came to see that what endured was not the decision she had made, but the way she kept making it. Integrity was not a line crossed once. It was a threshold revisited. Each day offered smaller versions of the same question, quieter, easier to miss. Would she look away? Would she soften the truth to keep the peace? Would she trade attentiveness for ease? These moments did not announce themselves as moral tests. They arrived disguised as convenience. She learned to slow down when things felt urgent. Urgency, she knew now, often belonged to power. It rushed people past reflection, framed compliance as efficiency. Miriam practiced pause instead, not as hesitation, but as respect for consequence. This habit changed how she spoke, how she listened, how she decided. It frustrated some. It steadied others. She accepted both reactions without needing to resolve them. At the shelter, a young volunteer once asked her how she knew when to speak up. The question was earnest, almost vulnerable. Miriam did not answer immediately. She said she listened for the moment when silence would cost someone else more than it protected her. That moment was not always obvious. It required attention, and sometimes courage arrived late. But when silence began to feel like participation, she knew it was time. She noticed how often people equated harmony with goodness, how conflict was treated as failure rather than information. Miriam no longer believed that peace was proof of health. Sometimes peace was simply fear arranged politely. She learned to tolerate tension without rushing to smooth it. Tension, held carefully, could reveal what mattered. Her life continued without dramatic milestones. No recognition arrived from the institution she had left. No apology followed. The absence no longer felt unfinished. It felt honest. Systems rarely acknowledged harm unless forced, and even then selectively. Miriam did not need that acknowledgement to proceed. Waiting for it would have kept her tethered to what had already let her go. She understood now that the city turning its back had not been personal. It had been procedural. Systems did not reject people because they were bad. They rejected people because they disrupted function. Miriam accepted this without bitterness. Understanding motive did not excuse harm, but it freed her from internalizing it. There were moments of joy she had not anticipated. Laughter that came easily. Friendships that formed without shared ideology, only shared care. Work that felt honest even when it was tiring. These moments did not erase loss. They balanced it. She allowed herself to receive them without suspicion. Miriam stopped asking whether she was still faithful. The question itself belonged to a framework she had outgrown. Faith, she understood now, was not proven by adherence. It was revealed by attention. Attention to suffering. Attention to power. Attention to the quiet voice that asked what harm her silence might allow. She carried no illusions about her capacity to change the world. She knew the scale of systems and the limits of individual action, but she also knew that systems depended on people continuing to comply without question. Every interruption mattered, even when it did not accumulate visibly. Especially then, doing the right thing had not led her to certainty or safety. It had led her to a life that required vigilance and humility. A life where she could not outsource responsibility or hide behind obedience. That life was harder. It was also truer. Miriam did not expect this truth to comfort her. She expected it to demand something of her. It did, daily, quietly, without applause, and she answered that demand not with perfection, but with presence. Again, and again, and again. Miriam accepted that presence did not always feel active. Some days it looked like listening without fixing. Other days it looked like naming a boundary and holding it even when it disappointed someone she cared about. Presence required discernment, and discernment required honesty about her limits. She was no longer willing to sacrifice herself to appear good. Goodness that demanded disappearance was no goodness at all. She noticed how often people confuse silence with peace. In meetings, in relationships, in institutions, quiet was praised as maturity. Miriam had lived long enough inside enforced quiet to recognize the difference. Peace invited voice. Silence, when imposed, suffocated it. She learned to ask gently whose comfort was being protected when quiet was demanded. The question unsettled people. It also opened space. Her days continued to unfold without markers. No anniversaries. No ceremonies. The absence of milestones once felt disorienting. Now it felt freeing. She no longer needed her life to follow a recognizable arc. She allowed it to remain responsive rather than scripted. This responsiveness became her discipline. Occasionally, fear returned in subtle forms. Not fear of punishment, but fear of insignificance. The worry that nothing she did mattered in any lasting way. Miriam learned to recognize this as another inheritance from obedience culture, where value was tied to approval and impact was measured externally. She countered it by returning to what she could see. A conversation that shifted. A moment of care that prevented harm. These were not dramatic, they were real. She thought sometimes about the word disobedience and how it had once been used against her like a verdict. The word had lost its sting. Disobedience, she now understood, was not chaos. It was discernment exercised without permission. It was responsibility accepted rather than deferred. That reframing did not erase caste, but it restored meaning. Miriam no longer felt compelled to justify her path to anyone, including herself. Justification belonged to systems that demanded defense. Her life required attention, not argument. When doubt arose, she did not debate it away. She examined it. Often, doubt revealed fatigue rather than error. Rest addressed it better than explanation. She began mentoring quietly, not formally, but through presence. People watched how she handled disagreement, how she held tension without domination, how she stepped back when her voice threatened to become too central. Modeling mattered more than instruction. She had learned that authority taught best when it refused to cling to itself. There were still losses she carried without resolution, relationships that never resumed, conversations that ended abruptly, doors that remained closed. Miriam did not romanticize these losses. She grieved them honestly. She also recognized that some costs were permanent. Accepting that truth prevented her from chasing repair where repair was not possible. The convent and the town became increasingly distant in her imagination, not erased, but contextualized. They were no longer the axis around which her story turned. She had moved beyond needing them to confirm or deny her worth. That shift felt like adulthood of a different kind, moral adulthood, one that did not seek shelter in authority. Miriam understood now that obedience had promised her safety by narrowing her choices. Disobedience had expanded her choices and removed the illusion of safety. What remained was responsibility. Responsibility was heavier than obedience, but it was honest. She would not trade it back. As she moved through the world, quietly, attentively, Miriam carried no banner and made no declarations. She lived in ways that reduced harm where she could and refused to explain it away where she could not. This was not heroism. It was practice. Doing the right thing had once cost her everything familiar. Now it asked her to keep choosing it without drama, without certainty, without reward. She chose it anyway, not because she was fearless, but because she knew what obedience without conscience demanded, and she had already paid that price once. She would not pay it again. Miriam understood now that there would always be moments when the world invited her back into old patterns, not overtly, not with commands, but with subtle appeals to comfort. An opportunity that required silence, a relationship that asked her to overlook something she could clearly see, a situation where compliance would smooth everything over quickly. These moments arrived quietly, dressed as relief. She learned to recognize the sensation in her body when this happened, a tightening in her chest, a familiar pull toward accommodation, the old instinct to disappear just enough to keep things intact. Miriam did not shame herself for feeling it. The impulse had once kept her safe, but she no longer allowed it to decide for her. Instead, she practiced staying present with the discomfort, letting it exist without rushing to resolve it. Often, that pause changed everything. What first appeared as a need to comply revealed itself as fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being alone again. Seeing the fear clearly weakened its authority. She noticed how often people mistook her calm for agreement. Silence was assumed to be consent. Miriam corrected this gently when necessary. She learned to say no without apology, to disagree without explanation, to name harm without demanding that others accept her framing. These skills did not come naturally. They were learned slowly, through repetition and mistake. There were times when speaking cost her connection. Conversations ended. Invitations stopped coming. Miriam felt the familiar sting, but it no longer confused her. Loss did not automatically mean she was wrong. It meant she had reached a boundary someone else was unwilling to cross. She allowed those endings to stand without chasing repair. At the same time, unexpected connections formed. People drawn not to certainty, but to steadiness. To the way she listened without rushing to manage. To the way she spoke without seeking dominance. These relationships grew quietly, without intensity, and endured. Miriam recognized in them a different kind of belonging, one that did not require self-erasure. She thought sometimes about the young woman who had been the catalyst for everything. The memory no longer carried urgency, but it carried weight. Miriam understood that one act of care had not changed the system, but it had interrupted something. Interruption mattered. It created a crack where certainty had once been sealed. Cracks allowed light, even if the structure remained standing. Miriam no longer believed that justice arrived cleanly. She had seen too much to expect symmetry.
Harm did not guarantee accountability.
Integrity did not guarantee safety.
What integrity guaranteed was coherence. She could live without negotiating herself into fragments.
She began to understand that the most difficult part of her path was not leaving, or being labeled disobedient, or losing belonging.
It was living without the comfort of moral superiority. She did not see herself as better than those who stayed silent.
She knew how fear worked. She knew how survival shaped choices.
This awareness kept her from hardening.
It kept her human.
There were days when exhaustion returned, not dramatic, but dull. On those days, she did less. She rested. She allowed herself to be ordinary. Resistance, she had learned, did not require constant exertion.
It required sustainability.
Burning out served no one.
Faith, if it could still be called that, remained woven into her attention.
It did not
demand belief in systems or certainty in outcomes.
It asked only that she remain awake to the cost of her actions and inactions.
That wakefulness felt sacred in a way obedience never had.
Miriam did not know how her story would be told, if it ever was. She suspected it would be simplified or misunderstood or forgotten entirely.
That no longer frightened her.
Meaning did not depend on narrative accuracy.
It depended on how she lived when no one was watching.
Doing the right thing had not made her exceptional. It had made her responsible. Responsible for noticing. Responsible for choosing. Responsible for living without hiding behind rules that protected harm. She accepted that responsibility without pride and without apology. And as her life continued, quietly, without resolution or applause, Miriam understood something that had taken years to settle. The greatest disobedience was never the act itself. It was the refusal to return to sleep once you had woken up. She stayed awake, and she kept living. Miriam carried that wakefulness with her like a low, steady flame. It did not burn brightly. It did not announce itself,
but it did not go out.
Even as seasons changed and circumstances shifted, that attentiveness remained, shaping how she moved through the world in ways that felt almost instinctive now. She noticed how often people longed for permission to stop pretending, permission to admit that something was wrong, permission to feel conflicted without immediately resolving the tension. Miriam recognized that longing because she had once lived inside it. She offered no permission slips. Instead, she modeled what it looked like to live without them.
That, she had learned, was more unsettling and more liberating than reassurance. There were moments when she felt the old grief rise unexpectedly. A hymn heard in passing.
The smell of incense drifting from an open church door.
A rhythm that once held her life together. She did not push these moments away.
She allowed them to pass through her, honoring what had been real without confusing it with what had been harmful.
Memory, she realized, did not have to be loyal to institutions to be honest.
Miriam's sense of self continued to loosen and strengthen at the same time. She was less defined, but more grounded. She did not cling to roles. She did not rush to replace what she had lost. Identity, once prescribed, now unfolded slowly, shaped by practice rather than promise. This unfolding required patience. She was
still learning to offer herself. She understood now that many systems survived not because people believed in them wholeheartedly, but because leaving felt unimaginable. The cost seemed too high, the uncertainty too vast.
Miriam did not blame those who stayed. She had stayed herself until she could not. Awareness did not arrive on schedule.
It arrived when it did, and then demanded response.
Sometimes she imagined the version of herself who had remained, the woman who had learned to silence discomfort, to explain harm as discipline, to mistake endurance for virtue. That version felt distant now, but not alien. Miriam held her with compassion.
She knew what that life required. She knew how much it asked someone to disappear, piece by piece. Her work at the shelter eventually expanded into other forms of engagement. Community meetings,
quiet mediation,
support offered without fanfare. She did not advertise her history.
She did not need it to justify her presence. Her authority, such as it was, came from consistency, from being there when things were difficult, from staying when others withdrew.
She noticed how easily people reached for simple narratives when confronted with complexity.
Victim and villain, right and wrong,
faithful and disobedient.
Miriam resisted those binaries gently but firmly.
She had lived long enough inside them to know how much they obscured.
Reality, she knew, was messier and more demanding.
It required attention rather than allegiance.
There were
still times when she wondered whether she could have done more,
spoken louder, pushed harder, stayed longer.
These questions visited her late at night, uninvited.
She did not chase them away. She examined them carefully, distinguishing between regret and responsibility. Regret imagined alternate outcomes, responsibility focused on present action. She chose the latter. Miriam accepted that she would never know the full impact of her choices. Some consequences unfolded beyond her sight. Others ended abruptly. Meaning, she had learned, was not measured by scale. It was measured by alignment, by whether she could stand inside her own life without flinching. She no longer waited for the world to catch up. She no longer needed systems to validate what she knew. She had learned to trust her perception, even when it stood alone. Especially then, doing the right thing had not saved her from loss. It had not protected her from loneliness. It had not delivered justice in any recognizable form. What it had done was quieter and more durable. It had given her a way to live without dividing herself, a way to act without outsourcing conscience, a way to remain present without surrendering to fear. And that way of living, practiced daily and imperfectly, had become her home. She did not call it obedience. She did not call it rebellion. She simply lived it, and that was enough. Miriam learned, over time, to recognize when a story had reached its natural resting place. Not an ending, exactly, but a point where pushing further would turn truth into repetition. Her life did not need escalation anymore. It needed care. She noticed how easily people assumed that once you left a system, you were free of it, as if distance alone dissolved influence. Miriam knew better. The system lived on in reflex, in language, in the urge to explain oneself. Freedom was not the absence of structure. It was the ongoing practice of choosing differently when the old structure resurfaced inside you. She caught herself sometimes rehearsing explanations she no longer needed, imagined conversations where she defended her choices, clarified her intentions, proved her sincerity. When she noticed this, she stopped. Explanation had once been a survival tool. Now it was optional. She did not owe coherence to those who had benefited from her silence. Her days continued to be marked by small decisions rather than defining moments. Whether to intervene in a conversation, whether to rest when guilt suggested productivity, whether to stay present when leaving would have been easier. These choices did not feel heroic. They felt necessary. They accumulated quietly, shaping a life that did not rely on approval to sustain itself. Miriam understood now that many people feared doing the right thing, not because they were immoral, but because they were tired. Tired of consequence, tired of being alone, tired of standing without reinforcement. She had felt that fatigue herself. She did not romanticize it. She respected it. Rest, she had learned, was not withdrawal from responsibility. It was what made responsibility possible. She allowed herself joy without justification, simple pleasures, and remarkable happiness. Laughter that did not need to mean anything. For a long time, she had believed joy had to be earned through sacrifice. That belief had made suffering feel purposeful. Letting go of it felt like another kind of disobedience, one she welcomed. The convent no longer appeared in her dreams. When it did, rarely, it was not threatening. It was distant, symbolic, a place that had taught her what obedience demanded and what conscience revealed. She did not need to revisit it to understand its influence. She carried the lesson without carrying the weight. Miriam stopped asking whether her life mattered in some grand sense. The question itself belonged to a worldview obsessed with scale and recognition. Her life mattered because it was lived with attention, because it reduced harm where it could, because it refused to explain harm away when it could not. That was enough. She had learned that the greatest danger was not punishment, but numbness. Not opposition, but forgetting. Doing the right thing required remembering what you had seen, even when remembering was inconvenient. Especially then. Forgetting would have been easier. She chose memory instead. There were no final words spoken over her life. No verdict issued. No reconciliation scene staged for closure. What existed was continuation. Days following days. Choices following choices. A life shaped less by what had happened to her and more by how she responded after. Miriam did not claim purity. She did not claim certainty. She claimed responsibility. And that responsibility, once feared, had become familiar. Not light, but manageable. Not glamorous, but real. It anchored her more securely than obedience ever had. Doing the right thing had once been the greatest disobedience. Now it was simply the way she stayed awake in the world. And she stayed awake, quietly, intentionally, without needing anyone to notice. Miriam understood, finally, that staying awake did not mean staying tense. For a long time, vigilance had felt like holding her breath, like bracing for a blow that might come at any moment. Over time, that posture softened. Wakefulness became less about guarding and more about noticing. less about resistance and more about presence.
She noticed how the world invited
Distraction constantly. Noise, speed, certainty offered as relief. People rushed past discomfort not because they were cruel, but because stillness made room for questions they did not know how to answer. Miriam did not exempt herself from that temptation. There were days when she wanted to stop noticing, to let the edges blur.
She recognized that desire without obeying it.
Her life did not shrink because she refused distraction.
It deepened.
Conversations slowed.
Relationships became more honest. She found that when she did not rush to reassure or resolve, others often discovered their own clarity.
This surprised her at first.
She had been taught that leadership meant guidance.
She now understood that guidance often meant restraint.
She no longer believed that conscience was a fixed voice that spoke clearly once and then fell silent.
Conscience was a practice. It sharpened with use and dulled with neglect. Each time she listened, it became easier to recognize.
Each time she ignored it, the silence grew heavier. Staying awake required repetition, not heroism.
Miriam accepted that there would always be people who misunderstood her choices. Some would call her bitter. Others would call her naive.
A few would frame her life as cautionary, proof that disobedience led to loss.
She let those interpretations exist without correcting them.
Meaning did not depend on consensus. It depended on alignment.
She understood now that the cost of obedience had never been obedience itself. It had been the quiet agreement to stop noticing harm when it became inconvenient.
That agreement was what she could no longer make.
Everything else followed from that refusal.
Her days remained unremarkable in the ways that mattered most.
She woke.
She worked.
She rested.
She paid attention. There were moments of fatigue, moments of doubt, moments of quiet joy. None of them demanded a conclusion.
Life no longer needed to prove anything to her.
Miriam no longer asked whether she was strong enough to keep living this way.
The question assumed a future test that would arrive dramatically.
Reality was simpler and harder. Strength was required in small, continuous ways.
In not laughing along when something cruel was framed as harmless.
In not turning away when someone needed to be believed.
In not explaining away what she could clearly see.
She had learned that systems did not collapse when confronted by truth.
They adapted. They absorbed. They waited.
What they struggled to
survive was persistence without spectacle.
Attention that did not burn out.
Integrity that did not demand recognition. Miriam had become that kind of interruption, not intentionally, but inevitably. As years accumulated, her life did not resolve into a lesson others could easily consume.
It resisted summary.
It did not fit neatly into failure or triumph.
That resistance felt right.
Simplification had always been the tool of control. Complexity preserved humanity. She understood now that
obedience and disobedience were not opposites. And thinking obedience and attentive conscience were. One asked for disappearance.
The other asked for presence. She had chosen presence, and that choice continued to shape everything. Miriam did not imagine herself as free in any absolute sense. She was still bound by limits, by responsibility, by the consequences of her past.
But she was no longer powered by fear of seeing clearly. That freedom was enough. Doing the right thing had once cost her
certainty, belonging, and safety. What it had given her was quieter, but more enduring. A life she could inhabit fully.
A conscience she did not have to manage.
A way of being that did not require sleep. And so she continued.
Not toward an ending, not toward recognition, but toward a life lived awake. And she stayed there.
Miriam eventually stopped wondering whether staying awake would always feel this way. She no longer expected it to resolve into ease or certainty.
Wakefulness had become familiar. Like a landscape she knew how to walk without needing a map.
There were still uneven paths, moments where she stumbled, but she trusted her footing now in a way she never had before.
She noticed how the language people used revealed what they feared. How often harm was described as misunderstanding. How often cruelty was softened into tradition.
Miriam listened for these shifts instinctively. Words mattered. They were the first place responsibility was negotiated away.
She did not
correct everyone.
She chose carefully when to intervene. Discernment meant knowing when silence protected and when it enabled. Her relationships deepened not through intensity, but through reliability.
People came to trust that she would not disappear when things became uncomfortable. That trust was built slowly, through many small moments where she stayed present instead of retreating.
Miriam recognized the irony. She had lost belonging by refusing to disappear, and she had found a different kind of belonging by doing the same.
There were days when she felt invisible again, but the feeling no longer frightened her.
Invisibility chosen was different from erasure imposed.
She could move quietly now without losing herself.
She could step back without vanishing.
That distinction mattered more than recognition ever had.
Miriam understood that her life would never offer the satisfaction of being clearly right in the eyes of those who mattered most to her once.
The convent would not call
her faithful.
The town would not see her as courageous.
She had accepted that long ago.
What surprised her was how little that mattered now. Validation had lost its urgency once she stopped organizing her worth around it. She thought sometimes about how obedience had promised her safety by narrowing her vision.
If she did not see harm, she did not have to respond to it.
Seeing clearly had taken that safety away.
It had replaced it with responsibility.
Responsibility did not feel protective. It
felt exposed, and yet she would not trade it back. Exposure had made her honest.
Her work continued to evolve without fanfare. She took on roles and released them.
She spoke when necessary and listened more often.
She remained alert to the temptation to become fixed, to turn her experience into doctrine. She resisted that pull deliberately. The moment she stopped listening, she knew she would begin to reproduce the very harm she had left.
Miriam no longer believed that moral clarity belonged
to the brave or the pure. It belonged to the attentive.
Anyone willing to notice what others preferred to ignore could find it.
That noticing carried cost, but it was available.
She trusted others to reach it in their own time.
As the years accumulated, her story did not fade.
It dissolved into practice.
It lived in how she made decisions, how she held tension, how she refused to disappear when silence would have been easier. There was no moment where this way of living felt complete. Completion was not the goal. Continuity was.
Miriam had learned that obedience asked her to sleep inside certainty. Disobedience had woken her into complexity.
Complexity did not offer rest, but it offered truth. She had chosen truth, not once, but repeatedly, without ceremony. And so her life continued, not marked by resolution or redemption, but by alignment. She stayed awake. She stayed present.
And in doing so, she lived a life that did not need permission to be whole.
Miriam no longer felt the need to
mark where her story began or where it might end. Time had stretched her sense of narrative into something less linear, more lived.
What mattered was not the origin of her wakefulness, but how she carried it forward without letting it harden into ideology or pride. She became attentive to how easily conviction could turn into rigidity.
She had seen that transformation before, inside the convent, where certainty became armor and armor became harm. Miriam watched herself carefully now, not with suspicion, but with humility. Wakefulness required flexibility. The moment it calcified, it stopped being conscience and became control. There were moments when she caught herself tempted to explain the world too neatly,
to categorize people as courageous or cowardly, awake or asleep.
When that happened, she stepped back.
She remembered how fear had shaped her own choices for years, how obedience had felt reasonable, even virtuous, before it became unbearable. Awareness, she knew, was not a
moral achievement. It was a process, uneven and deeply personal. Her work, whatever name it carried now, continued to be relational.
It lived in trust built over time, in conversations where people felt safe enough to doubt aloud.
Miriam learned to value those moments more than outcomes.
Outcomes could be claimed, measured, and often distorted.
Trust could not.
It had to be earned repeatedly.
She noticed that when she spoke less, others spoke more. When she resisted filling silence, people found
language for what they had been holding.
Silence, once used to erase, became a space where truth could surface. The distinction lay not in the quiet itself, but in who controlled it. Miriam had learned that difference the hard way.
Her life remained modest.
There were no symbols to represent it neatly.
No title that captured what she did or who she had become. That lack no longer felt like absence. It felt accurate. Identity, she understood now, was not something to be finalized. It was
something to be practiced.
Occasionally, someone would ask her if she ever missed the certainty she once had.
Miriam answered honestly.
She missed the ease of not having to decide. She missed the comfort of being told she was right.
But she did not miss the cost.
She did not miss the way certainty demanded blindness. She would not exchange clarity for comfort again.
She learned to forgive the city that had turned its back on her without reconciling with it. Forgiveness did not require return.
It required release. The city had acted to preserve itself.
Understanding that did not make it right, but it freed her from carrying its judgment forward.
She no longer needed to argue with what had already been decided. As years passed, the sharpness of the word disobedience faded entirely.
It no longer described her life.
What she practiced now did not feel like defiance.
It felt like responsibility assumed fully,
without delegation. Responsibility for noticing. Responsibility for choosing. Responsibility for staying present when walking away would have been easier.
Miriam understood that many people would never know the quiet cost of staying awake. They would see only outcomes, if they saw anything at all.
That invisibility did not trouble her.
She had learned that the most important work often happened beyond witness.
Her life did not stand as a warning or a model. It stood as evidence that another way of living was possible. Not grand,
Not heroic.
simply honest.
Doing the right
Thing had once isolated her, stripped her of belonging, and demanded that she rebuild herself without instruction.
Now it asked something different.
It asked her to remain attentive without becoming rigid,
To remain compassionate without becoming compliant.
to remain awake without becoming alone.
And Miriam, having learned what it costs to sleep through harm, chose that way again. Quietly.
Imperfectly, without needing permission, she lived. Miriam learned in time that living this way did not
Make her immune to doubt.
Doubt still arrived, sometimes without warning, slipping into ordinary moments.
It appeared when she was tired, when the world felt heavy, when injustice repeated itself without consequence.
The difference now was that doubt no longer paralyzed her. It informed her. It reminded her to slow down, to listen again, to check whether fear or clarity was guiding her next step.
She noticed how easily people searched for certainty in others, how often they asked what should be done, hoping for an answer that would relieve them of responsibility. Miriam understood the impulse. She had lived inside it for years. Now, when those questions came, she resisted the urge to provide resolution. She reflected the question back gently.
What do you see?
What are you afraid of? What would it cost you to act?
Responsibility returned to its rightful place.
There were moments when this disappointed people. They wanted direction, not discernment.
Miriam accepted that discomfort, without taking it personally. Leadership, she had learned, was not about being followed. It was about refusing to replace one authority with another.
Her life continued to expand in quiet, almost unremarkable ways. She learned new skills. She formed friendships that were not built on shared beliefs, but shared care.
She allowed herself to change her mind, something obedience had once forbidden. Changing her mind no longer felt like failure. It felt like evidence of attention.
She began to see
how deeply obedience culture shaped not only religious spaces, but secular ones as well.
workplaces that punished dissent politely, families that demanded silence in the name of peace, communities that prized unity over truth.
The pattern was familiar.
Miriam did not set out to dismantle it.
She disrupted it simply by refusing to participate fully in its illusions. There were days when she wondered whether her life would have been easier had she stayed. The answer was obvious.
Easier, yes.
Truer, no. She allowed herself that honesty without judgment.
Choosing integrity did not require pretending the alternative had no appeal. It required acknowledging the appeal and choosing otherwise anyway.
She no longer needed to narrate her life as a lesson.
She had learned that lessons imposed often became weapons.
Her life spoke quietly for itself, not as an argument, but as a presence that unsettled easy assumptions.
That presence was enough. Miriam understood now that what she practiced
Was not disobedience, but consent withdrawn.
consent to systems that demanded silence, consent to narratives that reframed harm as virtue, consent to belonging that required disappearance.
Withdrawing that consent had consequences. It also had integrity. As time went on, she felt less urgency to be understood and more commitment to be honest.
Honesty did not guarantee connection.
It made connection possible when it occurred. That distinction changed how she approached everything. She had learned
To live without a script, without guarantees, without the comfort of being certain she was right.
what she had instead was alignment.
Her actions no longer fought her conscience. Her silence no longer protected harm.
Her presence no longer required permission.
Doing the right thing had once been the greatest disobedience.
Now it was simply the rhythm of her life, a rhythm shaped by attention rather than obedience, by responsibility rather than fear,
By wakefulness rather than sleep.
and Miriam
Kept that rhythm, not perfectly, not heroically, but faithfully to what she had learned.
She stayed awake, and she lived. Miriam eventually noticed that wakefulness brought with it a quieter kind of courage.
Not the courage to confront, but the courage to remain unfinished, to resist the urge to close every question, to defend every choice, to make her life legible to others.
Unfinishedness, she learned, was not weakness. It was honesty. She stopped anticipating moments when everything would finally make sense. Life did not move toward clarity in a straight line. It looped.
It revisited old doubts with new understanding.
It tested familiar fears in unfamiliar forms.
Miriam met these moments without panic now. She had learned that regression was often just reflection wearing an old face.
She became more careful with her energy, not guarded, but intentional. She understood now that giving endlessly was another form of disappearance.
Care that consumed the caregiver was not virtuous.
It was unsustainable. Rest became an ethical practice, not a reward. She rested not because she was done, but because she intended to continue.
People sometimes mistook her steadiness for detachment.
They assumed that because she was calm, she was unaffected.
Miriam did not correct them. Calm was not absence of feeling.
It was relationship with it. She felt deeply. She simply no longer let emotion decide in isolation.
She noticed how often institutions depended on exhaustion to function.
Tired
people complied more easily.
Tired people stopped noticing. Tired people mistook survival for agreement. Miriam guarded against that erosion carefully, in herself and in others when she could.
Wakefulness required energy.
She treated it as something worth protecting. Her past no longer felt like something she had escaped from. It felt like something she had integrated.
The convent had taught her discipline. The town had taught her how power defended itself. Leaving had taught her discernment. None of these lessons were wasted.
They coexisted now, no longer in conflict, but in conversation.
She understood that conscience did not make her pure.
It made her responsible. Responsibility meant she would sometimes act too late, speak imperfectly, misunderstand others.
She accepted that risk, perfection had once been used to keep her silent.
She would not let it do so again.
Miriam no longer searched for a community that mirrored what she had lost. She built community differently now, loosely,
with room for disagreement,
with permission to leave, with no requirement to disappear to belong.
These communities were smaller, quieter, harder to define.
They were also real.
She thought sometimes about the word faithful and how narrowly it had once been defined for her.
Faithful meant obedient. Faithful meant quiet. Faithful meant enduring without complaint. Now, faithful meant attentive. Faithful meant honest. Faithful meant refusing to let harm hide behind language.
The word had not lost its meaning.
It had been returned to it. There were no final reckonings in her story.
No apologies arrived late to set things right.
No recognition reframed the past. Miriam accepted that some truths were lived rather than acknowledged.
Justice, when it came, was partial and uneven.
That reality did not negate her choices. It contextualized them. She had learned that doing the right thing did not guarantee transformation of the system that resisted it. Often, it transformed only the one who acted. That transformation was not small.
It was costly, slow, and irreversible.
Miriam did not measure her life by what it opposed anymore. She measured it by what it refused to reproduce.
Silence as virtue.
Obedience as morality. Certainty as care.
She refused those substitutions daily, sometimes quietly, sometimes aloud.
And in that refusal, she lived.
Not as a warning, not as an example, but as a woman who had learned to stay present in a world that preferred sleep. She stayed, and that was enough.
Miriam understood, at last, that nothing more needed to be added.
Her life did not require a final lesson, a summary, or a redemption arc that tied everything neatly together. What she had learned could not be compressed into a statement without losing its truth. It lived in practice, not conclusion, in attention, not answers. The convent remained, the city remained, the structures that had turned their backs on her continued, largely unchanged.
And Miriam no longer waited for them to understand what they had done.
Understanding was not a prerequisite for integrity.
Recognition was not a condition for truth. She had learned that doing the right thing was rarely loud. It did not announce itself.
It did not arrive with certainty or reward.
It arrived as a quiet decision made in the presence of fear, repeated until it became a way of living. That repetition was the work. That repetition was the cost.
Miriam did not see herself as brave.
She saw herself as unwilling to
disappear anymore.
Unwilling to explain harm away. Unwilling to trade conscience for belonging.
That refusal had taken her out of familiar shelter and into uncertainty. It had also given her a life she could inhabit without flinching. She stayed awake,
not in defiance, not in anger,
but in responsibility.
And in a world that functioned best when people looked away, that quiet wakefulness was enough. Her story did not end.
It continued in how she listened, in how she chose, in how she lived.
Without permission.
And that was the only ending it ever needed.